After midnight, Alaska changes. Roads stop behaving the way they should. Distances stretch. Silence grows heavier. These are true psychological horror stories from people who drove through Alaska at night and realized too late that the road was no longer just a road. Midnight Whispers Stories exists for listeners who want more than one night of horror. Subscribe now, because every story here connects to the next, and the deeper you go, the more familiar this feeling becomes. Story 1. Road that refused to end. What if the highway you were driving on never actually let you leave? What if every turn you took led you right back to where you started, and you did not even realize it was happening? That is exactly what happened to me. My name is Michael, and I'm going to tell you about the scariest, most disturbing night of my life. The kind of horror that stays with you. The kind of nightmare that makes you question everything you thought you understood about the world. I was driving through Alaska. Not on a tour, not for fun. I was running from a life that had fallen apart in ways I could not explain to anyone without sounding insane. Divorce, bankruptcy, and the kind of depression that makes you want to disappear. So I got in my truck and I drove north, away from everything. At 2 in the morning, I was somewhere between Fairbanks and the Arctic Circle on a highway that did not appear on most maps. The kind of road that only locals knew about. The kind of road that made sense when you wanted to vanish. Alaska has a special kind of darkness. Not just the absence of light, but something that feels active. Something that watches. I had been driving for 6 hours straight without seeing another vehicle, another person, or a single light besides my own headlights cutting through the eerie black. The landscape was terrifying and beautiful at the same time. Forests that stretched forever. Mountains that looked like they were holding their breath. And the sky, completely empty of stars, like someone had pulled a blanket over the world. Distances are deceptive at night in Alaska, especially when there are no lights or landmarks to give you any reference point. Your mind starts playing tricks. You begin to believe that the highway is infinite, that you are the last person alive, that the road has always existed and you have always been on it. My speedometer said I was driving at 60 miles per hour, but it felt like I was barely moving. The white lines in the center of the road blurred together. The darkness pressed against the windows. The heater hummed. The engine ticked. These sounds became the only proof that anything was real. Around 3:30 in the morning, something started to feel wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not the kind of wrong that makes you pull over immediately. It was a creeping sense of unease. A chilling sensation that crawled up my spine like something alive. I had been driving this highway for over 6 hours, and according to the signs I had seen, I should have reached Prudhoe Bay by now. Should have reached the most northern town in the United States. But the landscape had not changed. The same evergreen trees lined both sides of the road. The same rocky shoulders. The same eerie silence pressing in from all directions. I checked my GPS. It had stopped working about an hour ago. No signal. No maps. Just a blank screen. I told myself it was normal. Cell towers do not exist up here. GPS is unreliable near the poles. I was being paranoid. This was a haunted thought. Nothing more. But paranoia, I was learning, is sometimes a message trying to tell you something important. Sometimes it is your mind detecting danger before your conscious brain understands what is happening. At 3:45, I passed a mile marker. I remembered seeing the same mile marker 2 hours earlier. Not a similar one, the exact same number. At first, I convinced myself I was wrong. Tired, confused. I had been awake for nearly 30 hours. My mind was playing tricks. I was probably misremembering. But the disturbing sensation did not go away. It got stronger. I pulled over. The moment I stopped the truck, the darkness seemed to press in even closer. Outside the windows, there was nothing. Complete, absolute nothing. The kind of void that makes you understand how fragile human existence really is. I sat there for 5 minutes, just listening. The engine ticked as it cooled. My breathing sounded too loud. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. And underneath it all, something else. A low hum. A frequency that I felt more than I heard. It was coming from the road itself. I started driving again. Faster this time. 80 miles per hour. 90. The road seemed to go on forever in both directions. I was looking for anything different. A change in the landscape. A road sign. A building. Something to prove that I was actually making progress and not trapped in some nightmare loop. But the forest remained identical. The darkness remained absolute. The feeling of moving forward, despite what my speedometer said, slowly disappeared. This is when the real horror began. This is when I understood that something terrifying was happening. Something beyond any logical explanation. My speedometer said I was traveling at 95 miles per hour. I had been driving for 20 minutes at that speed. I should have covered close to 30 miles. But the landscape had not changed one bit. Not a single detail. The exact same bend in the road was coming up. The exact same dead tree on the right side. The exact same cluster of rocks. It was happening again. I pressed the accelerator down to 100 miles per hour. My truck screamed. The headlights shook. I was driving as fast as I could, watching the landscape carefully for any change, any proof that I was actually moving forward through space. But I was not, or at least, the world was not moving past me the way it should have been. After another 30 minutes at over 100 miles per hour, I saw the same dead tree. The same rock cluster, the same curve. Fear is a chilling thing. It starts small, a whisper of unease. But if you feed it, if you let it grow, it becomes something that consumes you completely. I was starting to feed it. I was starting to panic. I thought about pulling over. But what would that accomplish? I was in the middle of nowhere. The temperature outside was probably below zero. There were no houses, no lights, no other vehicles, no way to call for help. My phone had no signal. My GPS was dead. I was alone on this horrifying road that refused to let me leave. I started to count. 1,000 miles. That is how far I wanted to drive. 1,000 miles at my current speed would take about 10 hours. Surely something would change. Surely I would break free from whatever nightmare pattern I was in. I drove, and I drove, and I drove. The landscape remained identical. Not similar, identical. The dead tree appeared again and again. The rocks were always in the same position. The curve of the road was always the same. This was not paranoia anymore. This was not exhaustion playing tricks. This was something real, something terrifying, something that should not be possible. After what my clock said was 9 hours of nonstop driving at high speed, I finally saw something different. A gas station, just sitting there on the right side of the road, completely out of place. No building complex, no convenience store, just a single gas station with 4 pumps and a small light above the main door. It looked like something from the 1970s. The pumps were old, the paint was peeling, but there was a light on inside. I could see movement, a figure, a person. I pulled in so fast that I nearly lost control of the truck. I had not seen another human being in hours. I had not seen anything alive except the forest that surrounded me. The idea of talking to someone, of getting help, of understanding what was happening, made me desperate. I threw the truck into park and stumbled out of the door into the freezing Alaska night. The cold was so severe that it felt like physical pain. It bit at my exposed skin. It made my lungs burn with every breath. But I did not care. I ran toward the gas station door. I could see the figure more clearly now. It was standing behind the counter, perfectly still, watching me, waiting for me. I pushed through the door. The interior was warm, but it smelled wrong. Like something dead, like decay and copper and something else I could not identify. The fluorescent lights above created harsh shadows. The shelves were stocked with products I had never seen before. The dates on the cans were all from the 1980s. Some were from the 1970s. But what froze the blood in my veins was the figure behind the counter. It was a person, or it had been. The face was wrong, too smooth, too pale. The eyes did not blink. The smile was too wide. It stood in a posture that no living human being could maintain. I knew immediately that I had made a terrible mistake coming in here. This was not help. This was something else. Something unsettling and dangerous and deeply, fundamentally wrong. The creature spoke. Its voice sounded like a recording played at the wrong speed, like something trying to mimic human speech but not quite understanding how. It said, "Welcome to the last place." It said I had been driving the same road for 9 hours. It said I would continue driving the same road forever. It said this because I had tried to run away from myself, and the road would not let anyone leave until they understood that there was nowhere to run. I backed out of the station without breaking eye contact with the thing behind the counter. My hands were shaking. My breath came in short gasps. I got back to my truck and locked the doors. My hands were so cold and so terrified that I could barely turn the key in the ignition. When the engine roared to life, I pressed the accelerator and drove. But the road was different now. The dead tree was gone. The rocks were gone. There were new details. A sign that said you were already dead. A mailbox with no name. A telephone pole that had no wires attached to it. These changes were somehow more disturbing than the repetition, because it meant the road was aware of me. It was responding to my fear. The darkness was learning what scared me most. I do not know how much longer I drove. Hours, days. Time became meaningless. The road would change in horrifying ways. Sometimes I would see other vehicles parked along the shoulder, their doors hanging open. Sometimes I would see footprints in the snow that appeared to walk into the forest and never return. Sometimes I would see faces pressed against windows of houses that had no walls or roofs. Each new horror was designed to break me down. Each new image was meant to drive me deeper into panic and despair. What I understand now, what I have spent the last 5 years trying to process, is that the road was real. Alaska is real, but that stretch of highway exists outside of normal geography. It exists in a place where the laws of physics and space work differently. It exists for people like me, people who run, people who try to escape themselves, people who think the answer to their problems is distance and darkness and being alone. I do not know how I escaped. One moment, I was driving through an endless nightmare. The next moment, I saw lights. A town, a real town with real people. I pulled over and wept. I got out and walked into a diner and I told the waitress everything. She listened. She did not call me crazy. She simply said that this was the third person this month who had made it back from that road. She said I was lucky. She said most people never find their way out. They drive forever. Their trucks are never found. Their families never know what happened. The road keeps them. I returned to my life. I went to therapy. I tried to move forward. But I carry something with me now. A chilling awareness. A disturbing knowledge. I know that road exists. I know it is still out there. And I know that somewhere in Alaska, there are people right now, driving through the darkness, trying to escape something, and slowly discovering that they cannot. The road will not let them. The road never lets anyone leave until they surrender. Until they understand that running away is not the answer. Until they face the darkness inside themselves. Do not drive alone at night through remote highways. Do not run away from your problems. Because if you do, you might find yourself on a road that refuses to end. A road that does not appear on maps. A road where distances are deceptive and the landscape never changes and the feeling of moving forward slowly disappears. You might be driving right now without even realizing that you are already lost. You might be trapped and not know it yet. This is my warning. This is my confession. And this is my nightmare that I am sharing with you in hopes that you will never find that road yourself. Story 2. No signal beyond this point. I died on that road. Not in the way you might think. Not yet anyway. But the moment I saw that sign, I understood that everything I was before would cease to exist. The sign appeared suddenly along a dark stretch of Alaskan road. It was 3 in the morning. My GPS had been glitching for the last hour, and my cell phone showed absolutely nothing. No bars, no service, just that terrifying empty space where connectivity should be. In remote Alaska, losing cell signal after midnight is expected. People tell you when you plan a trip up there that you will be cut off, that you will be alone. But that night it felt different. It felt deliberate. The sign was wooden and weathered, mounted on 2 rotting posts at the edge of the highway. The letters were carved deep, almost angry in their precision. They read simply, "No signal beyond this point." There was no arrow. There was no official seal or government insignia. Just that stark warning glowing in my headlights like a curse written into the darkness itself. I remember thinking it was strange. Cell towers exist everywhere now. Even in rural areas, even in forgotten places, there is at least some signal. But this sign was telling me something different. This sign was telling me that what lay ahead existed in a different world entirely. I was driving a rental car I picked up in Anchorage, a silver sedan that had seen better days. The heater did not work properly, and the passenger window had a crack that whistled at high speeds. I should have turned back at that moment. Some part of me, some ancient instinct buried in the lizard brain, was screaming at me to reverse direction and drive back toward civilization. But I was a week into a road trip I had planned for months. I was a logical person. I did not believe in signs or omens. I believed in facts and evidence and the comfort of my own rationality. The road stretched ahead, perfectly straight, bisecting a forest of black spruce trees that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The asphalt was cracked and broken in places, and I could see patches where the road had been abandoned and reclaimed by the earth. Every mile after the sign felt less connected to the last. It was not just that my phone had no signal. It was that the air itself felt disconnected. The darkness felt thicker, more real, more present. I drove for what I thought was 20 minutes. The odometer told me it had been 47 miles. That did not match. Either my sense of time was collapsing, or the road was stretching. I knew that was not possible. But every sense in my body was telling me something was profoundly wrong. The first thing I noticed was the mailbox. It stood alone beside the road, weathered gray wood with the number 472 painted on its side in faded white. Behind it, barely visible through the trees, I could see the outline of a house. A structure made of wood and darkness. I could not see any windows. I could not see any light, but I could feel that house watching me as I drove past. That feeling of being observed by something patient and hungry. After the mailbox, the creepy atmosphere intensified. My headlights seemed weaker, as if the darkness was actually pushing back against them, refusing to be illuminated. The road began to curve in ways that did not match the GPS coordinates I had written down before my phone died. Trees crowded closer to the asphalt, and then I started seeing them. The objects in the forest. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks. Shapes hung from branches, pale and indistinct in the darkness. My rational brain told me they were just clothes, or tarps, or the natural way branches grew in twisted formations. But the more I drove, the more certain I became that those were not natural shapes. They were carefully arranged. They were positioned to be seen. Some of them were distinctly human in form, though I forced myself not to think too deeply about what that meant. The chilling realization crept over me slowly, like ice water in my veins. This road should not exist. Or rather, it did exist, but it did not exist in any place I could actually reach. Every time I tried to retrace my thoughts about where I was, my mind would slip away from the answer like trying to hold water in an open hand. The highway signs that should have marked my position were absent. The mile markers were missing. There was only that endless ribbon of broken asphalt stretching into the terror of endless night. My fuel gauge read 3/4 of a tank. It had read 3/4 of a tank for the last 50 miles. The clock on my dashboard had stopped at 3:14. The numbers simply would not change no matter how long I watched them. That was when I saw the other car. It was pulled off the road into a small dirt turnout, maybe a quarter mile ahead. Red brake lights glowed softly in the darkness, as if the car was still running. As if someone was sitting in the driver's seat, waiting. My heart rate accelerated. This was the first sign of another human being since I had passed that sign. I told myself that whoever was in that car might help me. They might know where I was. They might have a phone with signal. They might be lost as well. I pulled up behind the car and shut off my engine. The silence that followed was haunting. There was no wind. There were no animal sounds. There was only the sound of my breathing and the tick of my cooling engine. The other car was a dark sedan, similar to mine but older. The windows were fogged so completely that I could not see inside. I got out of my car. The air was not as cold as I expected. It was warm, actually, humid, like the air inside a closed room where someone had been breathing. I walked to the other car and looked through the window, cupping my hands around my face to block out the reflection of my own headlights. The driver's seat was empty. The passenger seat was empty. The back seats were empty. The car appeared completely abandoned, yet the lights were still on. The engine was still running, though I could not see any signs of the car actually moving. I tried the door handle. It was locked. And then I heard it, a sound from deeper in the forest. A voice, not calling out, but speaking, saying the same words over and over in a strange, distorted tone that did not quite sound human. The words were unclear, but the tone was unmistakable. The voice was terrifying in its mechanical, repetitive quality, like a recording playing on an endless loop. I ran back to my car and locked the doors. I drove. I did not think. I did not plan. I simply pressed the accelerator and moved forward into the darkness. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The speedometer climbed past 80 miles per hour, then 90. The headlights caught glimpses of the forest on both sides of the road, and with each flash of illumination I saw more of those pale hanging shapes. More of those arranged objects that my mind refused to fully comprehend. The fear that gripped me was not a rational fear. It was primal. It was the kind of fear that makes your skin crawl and your breathing shallow and your vision narrow to a point. Every nerve in my body was screaming that I was not safe. That I had never been safe. That the moment I drove past that sign, I had crossed into somewhere that operated by different rules. The road began to climb. Elevation was increasing according to the sensation of gravity, though my altimeter was not working. The trees became sparser, replaced by exposed rock and what looked like dirt that had not seen water in months or years. And then, suddenly, the road opened onto a plateau, and I could see outward across an expanse of darkness so vast and complete that it stole my ability to perceive depth. I was driving on a road that hung suspended over nothing. The edges were not fenced. There was no barrier. If I veered left or right, I would simply fall into that incomprehensible darkness below. My hands gripped the wheel with such force that my forearms burned. I kept my eyes forward, fixed on the thin line of road illuminated by my headlights. How many hours had I been driving? It felt like days. My fuel tank still read 3/4 full. My clock still read 3:14. My phone still had no signal. But something had changed in me. I was no longer the same person who had seen that sign. I was becoming something else. The longer I drove on this road, the more I felt myself slipping away. My memories of where I came from were becoming fuzzy and strange. I could not remember the name of my ex-wife. I could not remember what color my childhood house was. I could only remember the road. The unsettling truth began to settle into my consciousness like a nightmare you cannot quite wake from. I was not lost. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. This was not a malfunction. This was precisely how it was designed. The sign was not a warning. It was an invitation, an announcement that I had entered a place where the normal rules of the world no longer applied. Other cars began to appear. They were positioned at regular intervals along the shoulder of the road, each one empty, each one with its lights on, each one still running. I passed a blue pickup truck, then a white minivan, then a black SUV. All of them vacant, all of them waiting. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that those cars had been here for a very long time, and their drivers had never left. My own car began to feel different. The seat seemed more comfortable than it had before. The temperature was perfect, warm but not hot. The radio, which had been off, suddenly came on by itself. Static, distorted and creepy, played from the speakers. And underneath the static, I could hear voices. Not the same mechanical voice from the forest. Different voices. Many different voices, all speaking at once, creating a horrifying cacophony of sound. I tried to turn off the radio. The knob would not respond to my touch. The buttons did not work. The sound continued, growing louder, those overlapping voices becoming more intense, more terrible. They were saying my name, all of them, over and over. My name, repeated by 1,000 distorted echoes, emanating from the speakers and seeming to come from outside the car as well. From the road, from the darkness, from the very air itself. The fear transformed into something else then. Resignation. Understanding. I understood that I was not the first person to drive this road. I understood that I would not be the last. I understood that somewhere, at some point in the future, I would become one of those empty cars parked along the shoulder, my lights burning forever, my engine running forever, waiting for the next driver to pass and understand what I had understood. The road began to glow. The asphalt itself started to emit a faint luminescence, as if it was generating its own light from within. And in that light, I could see what lay at the end of the road. A structure, a building, impossibly massive and imposing, rising up from the plateau like something that had grown from the earth itself rather than been constructed. It had no windows, no doors, no visible entrances or exits, just smooth, dark walls that seemed to absorb the light from my headlights without reflecting any of it back. The building was drawing my car toward it. I realized this with a horrible awareness that the steering wheel was no longer responding to my input. The car was driving itself, or rather, I was no longer driving the car. Something else was, something that had taken control the moment I crossed that point of no signal. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to reverse and drive backward down that terrible road, back toward the sign, back toward the world I remembered. But I knew that was not possible. The only direction was forward. The only destination was that building. The car pulled to a stop directly in front of the structure. The engine shut off on its own. The headlights extinguished. In the absolute darkness that followed, I heard the sound of a door unlocking. Not my door, the driver's side door of one of the empty cars parked nearby. And then another, all the cars opening simultaneously. All of them in that horrible, eerie silence revealing empty interiors and somehow at the same time filled with a presence so overwhelming that my mind could not process it. My own hand reached for the door handle. It was not my hand. I was not controlling it, but it was still attached to my arm, and I felt every sensation as it moved. I felt the cold metal of the handle. I felt the mechanism click as it released the lock. I felt the door swing open. The air outside was not air at all. It was something thick and heavy, something that filled my lungs but did not taste like oxygen. It tasted like fear and metal and something ancient. Something that had been waiting in this place long before any human being ever found this road. I stood up on legs that were no longer entirely mine. I walked toward the building with hundreds of other people, or at least I walked with the shapes of hundreds of other people. I could not see them clearly, but I could feel them. All around me, all moving with that same horrible absence of free will. All drawn toward that massive dark structure by forces we could not resist and could not comprehend. The wall of the building was smooth and cold beneath my hand as I approached it. And as I touched it, I felt the entire structure pulse like a living thing. like I had just placed my hand on the skin of some enormous creature and made contact with its awareness. The wall opened. There was no mechanism, no door that swung or slid. The wall simply parted like lips, revealing an opening that descended down into darkness so absolute that it made the exterior night look like bright daylight. And I understood then, with perfect clarity, that this is where the drivers of those empty cars had gone. This is where everyone who drove past that sign eventually ended up. I was not afraid anymore. Fear had been replaced by something worse. Understanding, knowledge, the absolute certainty that I would spend whatever remained of my existence in that place, unable to leave, unable to scream, unable to be anything other than what I had become. As I lowered myself into that opening, I looked back at the road I had traveled. Even from this vantage point, I could see it stretching away into the distance. And on that road, moving toward the sign, toward this terrible place, was another pair of headlights. Another car, another driver who had decided to take that remote Alaskan highway late at night. Another person about to see that weathered wooden sign and decide, just as I had decided, that it was probably nothing to worry about. I tried to call out to that distant driver. I tried to warn them, but my voice was no longer something I could control. My mouth opened, and instead of words, what came out was static. The same creepy, mechanical static that had played on my radio. Mixed in with thousands of other voices. All of us, the drivers who had come before, speaking in that horrible unified chorus. Saying the same words over and over. No signal beyond this point. No signal beyond this point. No signal beyond this point. The wall closed. The darkness became complete. And somewhere in that absolute black, I understood that I had finally arrived at my destination. Not a destination I had chosen. Not a destination I had wanted. But a destination that had been waiting for me since the moment I was born. The question was not where I was. The question was always going to be, how long until someone else drives this road? If these stories already feel personal, that's not an accident. Midnight Whispers Stories is built for listeners who recognize this feeling. Long drives, no signal, the sense that something is following quietly. When you subscribe, you don't just get more stories. You get continuity, nights that connect. Subscribe now, because once you understand this kind of fear, you'll want to hear where it leads next. Story 3. Lights that followed. There are certain stretches of highway in Alaska where you can drive for 3 hours without seeing another soul. And that night I understood why some people never make it through them at all. I had been on the road for nearly 6 hours when the headlights first appeared in my rearview mirror. It was just past 2 in the morning on a moonless October night, the kind of darkness so complete it feels like driving through ink. The highway cut through endless forest, trees pressing in from both sides like walls of a tunnel that went on forever. My hands ached from gripping the wheel. The radio had gone to static an hour back, leaving only the hum of tires on asphalt and my own breathing to fill the silence. When those twin points of light materialized behind me, I actually felt relief. Another human being out here in this terrifying emptiness. Proof that the world still existed beyond my headlight beams. That relief lasted maybe 30 seconds. The lights stayed exactly the same distance back. Not closing in, not falling behind. Just there, constant, unwavering. I checked my speedometer. 65 miles per hour. I eased off the gas, dropping to 60. The lights maintained their position. I pushed it to 70. Still the same distance, the same eerie, perfect interval between us. My chest tightened. On these Alaskan highways, being followed does not feel random. It feels deliberate. It feels personal. There are no accidents out here. No coincidences. Every choice means something when you are this far from help. This deep into the wilderness where cell service died 200 miles back and the nearest town is a name on a map that might not even exist anymore. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was a trucker keeping pace, someone else fighting through the exhausting darkness. Maybe they were using my taillights as a guide, grateful for another vehicle to prove they had not driven off the edge of the world. But the fear growing in my stomach knew better. I had taken this route because of an emergency. My brother worked at a mining operation near Fairbanks, and he had called 3 days ago from a hospital bed. Accident. Serious. Come now? I had driven up from Anchorage without thinking. Without planning. Just throwing a bag in my truck and pointing north. Now I was somewhere between Willow and Cantwell, on a stretch of highway that barely qualified as maintained, where the shadows between the trees seemed to move with purpose and the darkness felt hungry. The lights behind me never wavered. I tried changing lanes even though there was no reason to, drifting from the right side to the left on the empty 2-lane road. The headlights followed with unsettling precision, mirroring my movement exactly. My mouth went dry. I reached for the coffee in my cup holder and found my hand shaking so badly I could not lift it without spilling. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The lights never came closer, never fell back. I started doing calculations in my head, trying to figure out what kind of vehicle could maintain such exact distance for so long. Cruise control. Maybe. But who sets cruise control at 2 in the morning on a nearly abandoned highway through the Alaskan wilderness? Who follows a stranger for half an hour without passing, without any variation in speed or distance? The answer that kept surfacing made my skin crawl. Someone who wants you to know they are there. Someone who wants you afraid. I considered flooring it, trying to outrun them, but something stopped me. Some instinct warned that breaking the pattern might trigger something worse. As long as we maintained this bizarre dance, this horrifying equilibrium, maybe I was safe. Maybe this was just observation, testing. The moment I panicked, the moment I tried to flee, perhaps that would be the signal they were waiting for. The trees seemed to press closer. My headlights illuminated nothing but road and forest, an endless repetition that started to feel like a loop, like I was not moving forward at all but trapped in some nightmare cycle. The white lines painted on the asphalt blurred together. My eyes burned from staring at the mirror, from watching those lights that never changed, never blinked, never revealed anything about the vehicle or driver behind them. Then I saw the turnoff, a small dirt road branching off to the right, barely visible, the kind of access route used by rangers or loggers. No signs, no indication where it led, just a gap in the trees and a narrow track disappearing into absolute darkness. Every rational part of my brain screamed not to take it. Leaving the highway meant leaving the last thread of civilization, diving deeper into isolation. But the irrational part, the part ruled by the creeping terror of those unchanging headlights, insisted that anything was better than continuing this dance. I had to break the pattern. I had to know. I jerked the wheel right without signaling, without slowing, my tires kicking up gravel as I veered onto the dirt road. The transition was violent, my truck bouncing over ruts and rocks. I accelerated, pushing forward into the tunnel of trees, branches scraping the sides of my vehicle with sounds like fingernails on metal. I watched the mirror. The headlights on the highway continued straight. They did not follow. They did not slow down. They just kept going, disappearing around a curve, swallowed by the night. Relief flooded through me so intensely I almost laughed. Paranoia, just paranoia and exhaustion. Some innocent driver who happened to be going the same direction, probably confused now about why I had suddenly vanished into the woods like a maniac. I eased off the gas, letting my heartbeat slow. The dirt road was rough but passable. I would follow it for a few miles, maybe loop back to the highway when my nerves settled. Give that other vehicle time to get far ahead. Arrive at the hospital with a story about my own paranoia to tell my brother. Something to make him laugh during recovery. The road curved through the forest, climbing slightly. The trees here were older, thicker, their trunks like columns holding up a cathedral of darkness. My headlights swept across them as I navigated the turns, creating moving shadows that danced and shifted. That was when I saw the turnoff I had taken in my rearview mirror, and the headlights that pulled onto it behind me. My blood turned to ice. Impossible. They had kept going. I watched them continue on the highway. Unless there were two vehicles. Unless whatever was following me knew about this road, had expected me to take it, had maybe even herded me toward it. The lights behind me maintained the same distance as before. Exact, unwavering, patient. I pressed the accelerator harder. The truck bucked over the rough terrain, suspension groaning. 60 miles per hour on a dirt road through dense forest in pitch darkness is insane. Borderline suicidal. But the fear overriding my judgment was worse than the physical danger. The trees blurred past. My headlights bounced wildly, illuminating brief snapshots of forest that looked increasingly wrong. The trunks too straight, the spacing too regular, like something had arranged them. The lights behind me kept pace effortlessly. I do not know how long I drove like that. Time stopped meaning anything. There was only speed and terror and the growing certainty that I had made a catastrophic mistake. This road was not going to loop back to the highway. This road was going exactly where someone wanted it to go. Then the trees ended. I burst into a clearing so suddenly I nearly lost control, my truck fishtailing as the dirt road opened into a wide, flat expanse. I hit the brakes, tires screaming, coming to a stop in a cloud of dust. And I saw what was waiting. In the center of the clearing sat a building. Not abandoned, not old, new. A large metal structure with no windows, no markings, just smooth walls reflecting my headlights like a mirror. Floodlights mounted on poles around the perimeter bathed everything in harsh white light bright enough to hurt my eyes after so long in darkness. The building had one door, a heavy steel thing, closed. No other vehicles. No sign of habitation. Just the building and the lights and the overwhelming wrongness of finding something like this in the middle of nowhere. I looked in my rearview mirror. The headlights that had followed me were gone. The road behind me was empty, just darkness between the trees. But in front of me, parked near the building, its entrance where my headlights had not reached, sat a truck identical to mine. Same make, same model, same color. My hand started shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. The steel door of the building opened. A figure stepped out, silhouetted by the interior light behind it. It walked toward my truck with measured steps, unhurried. As it came closer, the floodlights revealed details that made my vision swim. It was me, exact height, exact build, wearing the same jacket I had thrown on before leaving Anchorage. The same boots. It walked the way I walk, with that slight favor of the left leg from an old hiking injury. The figure stopped 10 feet from my truck. It did not speak. It just stood there, illuminated by my headlights, staring at me through my windshield. Then it raised one hand and pointed at the building. The steel door was still open. Light spilled out, revealing nothing of the interior. Just brightness, emptiness, waiting. I understood with sudden, crushing clarity that I was supposed to go inside. That this entire night had been designed to bring me here. The headlights following at that exact distance. Never threatening enough to make me call for help, but terrifying enough to drive me off the highway. The turnoff appearing at precisely the right moment. This clearing, this building, this thing wearing my face. My brother had called 3 days ago. But my brother died in a mining accident 6 months ago. I attended his funeral. I helped scatter his ashes. So whose voice had I heard on the phone? The figure outside my truck lowered its hand. It turned and walked back toward the building, its gait matching mine perfectly, every step identical to how I moved through the world. It reached the doorway and stopped, looking back. Waiting. I put my truck in reverse. The engine roared. I spun the wheel, tires spitting gravel, executing a frantic three-point turn. My headlights swept across the clearing, across the building, across that other truck that should not exist. As my lights passed over the open doorway, I glimpsed movement inside. Figures, dozens of them, all standing motionless, all facing the entrance, all looking exactly like me. I floored the accelerator, racing back into the forest, the dirt road a nightmare of shadows and branches. The clearing disappeared behind me. No lights followed this time. Nothing pursued. I drove in pure terror until the dirt road finally, mercifully, intersected with the highway again. I merged back onto the asphalt and drove north. I drove until dawn broke over the mountains. I drove until I reached Fairbanks and confirmed at the hospital that my brother was dead, had been dead for months, and no one had called me from this number. I never found that turnoff again. I have driven that stretch of highway a dozen times since, in daylight and darkness, looking for the dirt road. It is not there. The forest shows no gap, no access route, nothing but unbroken trees for hundreds of miles. But sometimes, late at night when I am driving alone, I see headlights in my mirror that maintain a perfect distance behind me. They never get closer. They never fall back. They just follow, patient and unwavering, like they are waiting for me to remember where I am supposed to go. And in the darkness between the trees, I swear I can still see that building waiting. The door still open. The figures inside still watching. Still wearing my face. Still waiting for me to come home. Story 4. Radio stayed on static. I should have known something was wrong when the radio refused to turn off. It was 3 in the morning on a highway outside Fairbanks, Alaska, and I had been driving for 6 hours straight. The kind of drive where you question every decision that led you there. My headlights were the only thing cutting through the darkness, and the road stretched endlessly into a black void that seemed to swallow everything. The Alaskan radio stations faded one by one after midnight, leaving nothing but static. White noise, the sound you learn to live with on these long, empty drives through the wilderness. But this static was different. At first, I thought I was imagining it, the fatigue playing tricks on my mind. But every time I reached for the dial to shut it off, the static would shift. Not louder, not softer, just different, like it was breathing, like it was waiting for something. I turned the knob clockwise. The static remained. I jabbed the power button 5 times. Nothing changed. The sound kept hissing through the speakers, filling the truck cab with that horrible, scratching noise that made my teeth ache. Turning the radio off made the quiet worse. That realization hit me like ice water. Because when I finally yanked the radio faceplate completely out of the dashboard, ripping the wires free in a moment of desperate frustration, the static did not stop. It kept playing from speakers that were no longer connected to anything. My hands started shaking on the steering wheel. The highway ahead looked wrong now. The painted lines seemed to curve in ways that defied the straight road I knew I was on. Shadows moved between the trees on both sides, keeping pace with my truck even though I was doing 70 miles per hour. In Alaska, you learn quickly that the wilderness does not care about you. It does not notice you. But that night, I felt noticed. I felt watched by something vast and patient and terrifying. The static began forming patterns, rhythms, almost like Morse code, but wrong. Too organic, too intentional. I could hear something underneath it now. Faint, like voices drowning in an ocean of white noise. I strained to make out words, leaning closer to the dashboard even though every instinct screamed at me to get as far from those speakers as possible. The voices were not speaking English. They were not speaking any language I recognized. They sounded wet, gargled, like something speaking through a mouthful of mud and broken glass. Then I saw the first sign. A weathered green road marker emerged from the darkness, reflective paint catching my headlights. Welcome to Coldbrook, population 147. I had never heard of Coldbrook. My GPS showed nothing but empty forest for another 60 miles in every direction. No towns, no gas stations, nothing, but the sign was real. Old, the paint was faded and peeling, revealing rust underneath. Someone had scratched something into the metal below the town name. I only caught it for a second as I passed, but the words burned into my memory. They are listening. My foot eased off the gas without me consciously deciding to slow down. The truck decelerated as the static grew louder, more insistent. The voices underneath were clearer now, chanting, a dozen voices, maybe more, all speaking in that horrible wet rhythm. And they were getting closer, not in distance, in presence, like they were climbing through the speakers, pushing through the barrier between their world and mine. The road curved ahead, and buildings appeared. Coldbrook existed after all, a main street with maybe 15 structures, dark storefronts with broken windows, a gas station with pumps that looked 40 years old, a diner with a neon sign that flickered weakly, casting red light across empty booths inside. Everything was abandoned. Everything except for the radio tower at the far end of town. It rose above the buildings like a skeletal finger pointing at the sky. Red lights blinked slowly along its length, marking it for aircraft that would never fly this far north at this hour. But something was wrong with those lights. They were not blinking in the standard pattern. They pulsed in rhythm with the static, in rhythm with the chanting voices, in rhythm with my own heartbeat, which was now hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I should have kept driving, should have punched the gas and blown through that ghost town without stopping. But fear does strange things to rational thought, and the static was so loud now that it felt like it was inside my skull, vibrating my bones, making my vision blur at the edges. I pulled over in front of the diner. The engine died before I turned the key. Just stopped. The headlights went dark. Everything went silent except for the static, which now filled the world like a living thing. I sat in complete darkness, gripping the steering wheel, breathing fast and shallow. Through the windshield, I could see the radio tower in the distance. Its red lights pulsed. The static pulsed. Something was connecting me to that structure. Something was drawing me toward it. The driver's side door opened by itself. Not quickly, slowly. The latch clicked and the door swung outward with a long, creaking groan. Cold Alaskan air rushed in, carrying the smell of pine and something else. Something chemical, something burnt. I tried to grab the door, tried to pull it shut, but my arm would not move. My entire body was locked in place, frozen, not by temperature, by will, by something else, its will pressing down on mine like a physical weight. I stepped out of the truck without wanting to. My legs moved on their own, carrying me forward. My boots crunched on gravel as I walked down the middle of the empty street toward the radio tower. The static was deafening now, but underneath it, the voices were clear. They were not chanting words. They were chanting numbers, coordinates, repeating the same string over and over in that wet, horrible cadence. The buildings on either side of me were wrong. The angles were too sharp, the shadows too deep. Windows reflected nothing, not even the blinking red lights from the tower. They showed only darkness. Absolute, complete darkness, like looking into holes in reality itself. And in that darkness, shapes moved. Tall, thin, humanoid but wrong in ways my mind refused to process fully. They pressed against the windows from inside, watching me pass. I reached the base of the radio tower. Up close, it was massive, ancient. The metal was corroded and covered in strange markings that might have been graffiti but looked more like warnings. Like prayers, like desperate attempts to contain something that could not be contained. A door at the base stood open. Rusted hinges, a metal staircase spiraling upward into darkness. The static was coming from up there, from the top of the tower, from the transmission equipment that should have been dormant for decades but was clearly, impossibly, still broadcasting. I climbed the stairs. Each step rang out in the night, the sound swallowed immediately by the static. The voices grew louder as I ascended, more distinct. I could almost understand them now, almost grasp the meaning behind the numbers they repeated. Coordinates, yes, but not for any place on Earth. They were dimensional, describing a location in space that existed outside normal geometry. A place where the laws of physics bent and broke and bled into something else entirely. The platform at the top was small, barely large enough for the old transmission equipment that hummed and crackled with impossible energy. No power lines connected to this tower, no generator, but electricity arced between the components, blue and white and violet, casting flickering light across the platform. And standing in front of the equipment was a figure. It wore the uniform of a radio operator from the 1950s. Clean, pressed, completely anachronistic. The figure did not turn to look at me. It simply stood there, one hand resting on a large dial, adjusting the frequency with slow, deliberate movements. As the dial turned, the static shifted, the voices rose and fell. Reality seemed to flex around us like a membrane being pressed from both sides. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. The figure finally turned its head. There was no face, just static, visual static, like a television tuned to a dead channel, where features should have been. And in that static, I saw things. Glimpses of other places, other times, other versions of this moment playing out across infinite possibilities. In some, I turned and ran. In others, I reached for the equipment. In most, I simply stood there, frozen, while reality unraveled around me. The figure spoke without a mouth. The voice came from everywhere at once. You answered the broadcast. I had not answered anything. I had just been driving, just trying to get home. But the figure shook its head slowly, and I understood. By listening, I had answered. By letting the static into my mind, into my thoughts, I had opened a door. And now something was coming through. The sky above the tower began to tear. Not metaphorically, actually tear, like fabric ripping. Behind the darkness of the Alaskan night, there was something else. Something vast and ancient and aware. It pushed against the membrane of our reality, testing the barrier, finding the weak point that this tower represented. That the figure represented, that I now represented. The static reached a crescendo. Every speaker in every abandoned building in Coldbrook erupted with sound. The voices were not chanting anymore. They were screaming, celebrating, calling to something that was finally, after decades of trying, about to break through. The figure reached out and touched my forehead with one finger. Everything stopped. The static, the voices, the tearing sky, everything froze in a single instant of perfect, horrible clarity. And in that clarity, I understood. Coldbrook was not a town. It was a seal, a spiritual, geographical seal placed over a wound in reality. The tower was not broadcasting out. It was broadcasting in, keeping something contained, keeping something from listening to our world and finding its way here. But seals break, and I had just become part of the broadcast. When I woke up, I was back in my truck. The engine was running. The radio was playing normal music from a Fairbanks station. Dawn was breaking over the trees. I was parked on the side of the highway, exactly where I had been before seeing the sign for Coldbrook. No town ahead, no radio tower, just empty road stretching into the distance. I checked my phone. 6 hours had passed. There was mud on my boots, the kind of mud that does not exist on maintained highways. And in my jacket pocket, I found something I had not put there. A piece of paper, old, yellowed, with coordinates written in hand that was not mine. The same coordinates the voices had been chanting. I drove home in silence, threw away the paper without looking at it again, tried to forget. But every night since then, when I am alone in the quiet, I hear it. Faint, distant, like an echo from somewhere far away. The static stayed on, and now it is inside me, broadcasting outward, calling to others who might be driving through the darkness, who might be tired and alone and vulnerable, who might hear a voice underneath the white noise and lean closer to listen. Because that is what seals do when they break. They do not shatter all at once. They crack slowly, one person at a time. one broadcast at a time. The radio tower in Coldbrook is still out there, still transmitting, still waiting for the next driver to answer the call. And somewhere in the static between stations, something vast and patient and terrifying is listening back. Story 5. Turn that was not on the map. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened on that highway in Alaska. There are roads in this country that should not exist. Roads that appear on no official map. Roads that vanish by morning. I found one of them 3 weeks ago, and I'm still not sure if I ever truly left it. I was driving from Anchorage to Fairbanks, a route I had taken dozens of times for work. Medical supply delivery pays well in Alaska, especially the overnight routes when nobody else wants to drive through the darkness and cold. The money was good enough that I stopped asking questions about why certain deliveries could only happen after midnight. That was my first mistake. The highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon cutting through an ocean of snow and trees. My phone sat in the dashboard mount, glowing with the navigation app I had used 1,000 times before. The blue line showing my route pulsed steadily, reassuring me that I was exactly where I needed to be. Then at 2:47 in the morning, the screen flickered. The map disappeared for just a second. When it returned, there was a new turn ahead, a right turn onto a road that had not been there moments before. I blinked hard, assuming the cold and exhaustion were playing tricks on my eyes, but the turn remained on the screen. The app announced it calmly, as if this road had always existed. In 500 feet, turn right. My headlights caught the turn as I approached. A narrow dirt road branching off into the forest. No sign, no marker, just a gap in the trees that looked freshly cut. The snow on either side packed down as if vehicles had recently passed through. Something in my chest tightened. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to keep driving straight, to ignore the app, to trust what I knew about this highway. But the app recalculated when I passed the turn. The pleasant voice became insistent, make a U-turn when possible. The blue line on the screen twisted back toward that unmarked road. I told myself it was a software glitch, that I would report it later, that I just needed to keep moving forward. Except the app kept recalculating. Over and over, the voice grew more urgent with each repetition, filling the cabin of my truck with a mechanical anxiety that infected my own thoughts. I made the U-turn. I did not know why. Maybe it was the isolation, the way being alone on dark roads for too many nights had worn down my judgment. Maybe it was the creeping fear that something was wrong with my route, that I had somehow gotten lost without realizing it. Or maybe it was something else, something I still cannot name. A compulsion that felt like it came from outside my own mind. The moment my tires left the paved highway and crunched onto that dirt road, my phone screen went black. Not off, black, a pure darkness that seemed to absorb the light from the dashboard. I grabbed the phone and tried to restart it, but it would not respond. The battery had been at 78%. Now it was dead, as if something had drained it in an instant. I stopped the truck and sat in the sudden silence. My engine idled roughly, the only sound in a world that had gone terrifyingly quiet. No wind, no animal calls, nothing. The forest on either side of the road stood perfectly still, the trees so close together that my headlights barely penetrated the spaces between them. I could see maybe 30 feet ahead before the darkness became absolute. Turning around felt like an option that had already passed. I cannot explain that feeling any better than that. It was as if the decision to come down this road had locked me into a path I could no longer escape. The idea of backing up, of returning to the highway, felt physically impossible, like trying to walk through a wall. So I drove forward. The road twisted deeper into the forest. My headlights caught strange details. Trees that had been carved with symbols I did not recognize. Patterns in the snow that looked almost like words written in a language that hurt to look at. Once, I saw what appeared to be a deer standing at the edge of the road, but when my lights hit it fully, I realized it was facing the wrong direction. Its head was on backwards. I drove faster. The speedometer climbed to 40, then 50, absurd speeds for a narrow dirt road in winter. But I needed to get through this. I needed to reach the other side and find my way back to civilization and sanity. The road seemed to stretch on forever, winding through identical sections of forest that made me question if I was moving at all or just driving in circles. Then I saw the light ahead. Not headlights, not streetlights, a pale blue glow that pulsed like a heartbeat, emanating from somewhere deeper in the forest. As I got closer, I realized the glow was coming from a building set back from the road. A small structure that looked like it might have once been a ranger station or a hunting cabin, but had been abandoned for years. Decades, maybe. Every window blazed with that sickly blue light. Shadows moved inside, crossing back and forth in patterns that seemed almost choreographed. I slowed down without meaning to, my foot easing off the gas as if controlled by someone else. The truck rolled to a stop directly across from the building. That was when I heard the knocking. 3 sharp raps against my driver, the side window. I jerked away from the sound, my heart trying to punch through my ribs. There was nothing outside my window, just darkness and snow and that terrible blue light reflecting off the glass. But I had heard it. I had felt the vibration of knuckles striking the window. The knocking came again. 3 raps, deliberate, demanding. I stared at the empty space outside my window and watched as something began to form in the darkness. Not emerging from behind a tree or approaching from a distance. Forming, condensing out of the shadows like smoke becoming solid. A figure, tall, impossibly thin, with a face that was almost human but stretched wrong, pulled in directions that faces should not go. It knocked a 3rd time. The window cracked, a hairline fracture spreading from where those unseen knuckles had struck the glass. The figure tilted its head, studying me with eyes that reflected the blue light from the cabin. Then it smiled, and I saw that its mouth had too many teeth. I slammed my foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning in the snow before finding traction. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I could not. I focused on the road ahead, on getting as far from that cabin and that thing as possible. The forest blurred past. The road twisted and turned in ways that defied geography, doubling back on itself, leading me in spirals that should have been impossible. And then I was on the highway again. The paved, normal, blessed highway. My headlights illuminated the familiar white lines and reflective markers. I checked my mirrors and saw nothing behind me but empty road. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, suddenly alive again, showing 78% battery and a map that displayed only the standard route from Anchorage to Fairbanks. No mysterious turn, no dirt road, nothing. I pulled over and sat shaking for 20 minutes. Eventually, I continued to Fairbanks, made my delivery, and drove home. I told myself it was exhaustion, hallucination, a micro-sleep that had created a vivid nightmare. But when I got home and examined my truck in daylight, I found the crack in my driver's side window. 3 points of impact, exactly where the knocking had come from. I quit the overnight routes. I told my boss I was done with midnight deliveries. Consequences be damned. He did not argue. He just looked at me with an expression I now recognize as understanding. As if he knew. As if he had been waiting for this. Last week, I was talking to another driver at a truck stop outside Anchorage. An older guy who had been running routes in Alaska for 30 years. I mentioned, carefully, that I had experienced something strange on the highway. He went quiet. Then he leaned close and asked me if I had found the turn that was not on the map. He told me he had found it too. 15 years ago. He said a lot of drivers have found it over the years. Some of them never came back from it. The ones who did come back, like us, they all have the same story. The same dirt road, the same blue light, the same thing knocking on their window. He said the road moves around. It appears in different places, on different nights, calling to drivers who are alone and tired and vulnerable. He said something else too, something that keeps me awake at night. He said the turn is not really a road. It is a test, a filter, and those of us who made it back, who escaped, we only got out because we were not what it was looking for. The ones who never returned, the drivers who vanished on Alaska as highways with no trace, they were what it wanted. I think about that constantly. I think about the figure outside my window, studying me with those horrible eyes. I think about how it smiled when it saw something in me. Not recognition, not hunger, disappointment. What terrifies me most is not what I saw on that road. It is the question that haunts me every single night. If I was not what it wanted, what was it looking for? And what happens to the people who are? Story 6. Mile marker that repeated. I should have turned back the moment I saw mile marker 227 for the second time. But you do not turn back on the Dalton Highway at 3 in the morning when your fuel gauge is dancing near empty and the nearest gas station might as well be on another planet. You keep driving. You tell yourself you miscounted. You tell yourself the darkness is playing tricks. You tell yourself anything except the truth that is crawling up your spine like cold fingers. Mile markers are important on Alaskan highways at night. They are the only proof you are making progress through an endless tunnel of black spruce and shadow. The only confirmation that you exist in a world with distance and direction. Without them, you might as well be driving through the void itself. I had been hauling freight for 17 years, Anchorage to Dead Horse and back, the same route every week. My wife said I was married to the road more than I was married to her. And maybe she was right, because now she lives in Fairbanks with a dentist named Marcus, and I still drive this highway along. The Dalton does not care about your failed marriage or your bad knees or the way your hands shake when you pour your morning coffee. It just stretches north for 500 miles of gravel and ice and darkness so complete it feels like drowning. That night in October, I left Fairbanks 2 hours behind schedule because the loading crew could not find half my cargo. By the time I crossed the Yukon River, the last gasp of civilization before the Genjung wilderness begins, it was past midnight. The temperature had dropped to 15 below. My headlights carved 2 weak tunnels through air so cold it looked solid. Mile marker 225 passed, then 226. Normal. Expected. The GPS showed me creeping north at a steady 50 miles per hour, which is about as fast as anyone sane drives the Dalton in October. The road was empty. It always is. Sometimes you could drive for 6 hours without seeing another vehicle. Just you and the terrifying vastness of Alaska pressing in from all sides. Then came mile marker 227. White numbers on a green rectangle, caught in my headlights for 3 seconds before the darkness swallowed it again. I noted it without thinking, the way you note anything familiar and meaningless. The heater rattled. The radio hissed static because I was too far north for any station to reach. My coffee had gone cold in the cup holder. 15 minutes later, I saw mile marker 227 again. The exact same sign, the exact same placement on the right side of the road. White numbers on green, 227. My foot eased off the accelerator. The truck slowed to 40, then 30. I checked the GPS. It showed me at mile marker 232, 5 miles north of where the sign said I was. 5 miles of road that, according to this marker, had never happened. I told myself the sign was wrong. A maintenance error. Someone had installed a duplicate by mistake. It happens. The State Highway Department is not known for its attention to detail this far north where barely anyone drives and fewer people care. But my hands were gripping the wheel tighter now. My breath was fogging the windshield despite the heater blasting. Something felt wrong in a way I could not name, the way animals know a storm is coming before the sky changes. I kept driving. Mile marker 228 appeared right where it should. Relief flooded through me. Just a mistake. Just a duplicated sign. Nothing scary or impossible. Just human error in a place where humans barely exist. Then at mile marker 233, I saw it again. Mile marker 227. The third time. The same sign in a place where it had no right to be. The distance felt wrong now. Deeply wrong. Like the road itself was folding back on itself, like I was driving through a loop that had no exit. The GPS still showed me moving north, the numbers ticking up steadily, but the mile markers were telling a different story. A horrifying story. I pulled over. The truck shuddered to a stop on the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires. I killed the engine. Silence dropped over everything like a burial shroud. No wind, no animals, no sound at all except my own breathing, harsh and fast in the darkness of the cab. Outside the windows, the forest pressed close. Black spruce trees like skeletal fingers reaching toward a sky with no stars. The cold was immediate and absolute. I could feel it seeping through the doors, through the floor, turning the cab into a refrigerator. My breath came out in white clouds. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a fist. -15 feels like -50 when you are standing still. I swept the flashlight across the road, the beam shaking because my hands were shaking. Gravel, frost, tire tracks that could have been mine or could have been from days ago. Nothing unusual, nothing that explained the repeating mile marker. Then I heard it, a sound like breathing, deep and slow and wrong, coming from the trees to my left. Not animal breathing, not human breathing, something else, something that used breathing as camouflage. I turned the flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating tree trunks and shadow and nothing else. But the breathing continued, steady, patient, close enough that I should have been able to see what was making it. Fear is a chemical thing. It floods your bloodstream, sharpens your vision, makes time move like syrup. I was back in the truck with the doors locked before I made a conscious decision to move. My hands fumbled the keys. The engine turned over once, twice, caught. I slammed the transmission into drive and hit the accelerator hard enough to spray gravel behind me. The truck lurched forward, headlights sweeping across the road. And there in the beam, standing directly in my path, was a figure. Not a person, not exactly, tall and thin and wrong in proportions I could not define in the half-second before I swerved. Arms too long, head tilted at an angle that would break a human neck, eyes that reflected my headlights like an animal, size but with an intelligence behind them that made my stomach turn to ice. I missed it by inches. The truck fishtailed on the gravel. I fought the wheel, got control back, accelerated harder. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figure still standing in the road, perfectly still, watching me flee. Mile marker 234 flashed past, then 235. Normal sequence. Normal distance. But I knew it was not over. Whatever was happening on this stretch of highway, whatever impossible thing was folding the road back on itself, it had not finished with me yet. At mile marker 240, the headlights started flickering. On, off, like something was draining the battery. The engine ran fine, but the lights were dying. I pounded the dashboard with my fist. The light steadied for a moment, then flickered again, worse than before. And in that flickering, in the moments of darkness between the light, I saw them. Figures standing along both sides of the road. Dozens of them, tall and thin and wrong, all watching me pass with those terrible reflecting eyes. They did not move. They just stood there in the trees, in the darkness, witnesses to something I could not understand. The mile markers kept counting up, 241, 242, 243, but the GPS had frozen at mile marker 227. The screen was stuck, the blue dot of my position unmoving no matter how far I drove. According to the satellite, I had never left that spot. According to the satellite, I was still back there where the road started repeating. My fuel gauge was dropping faster than it should. A quarter tank when I had checked it 20 minutes ago, now showing almost empty. The math did not work. Nothing worked. The rules of distance and fuel consumption in reality itself had stopped applying. At mile marker 250, the road ended. Not gradually, not with warning signs or barriers. It just ended. The headlights, still flickering, illuminated gravel and then nothing. A wall of absolute blackness that my headlights could not penetrate. Like I had reached the edge of the world. I hit the brakes. The truck skidded to a stop 3 feet from that wall of dark. The engine idled. The heater rattled. My heart slammed against my ribs hard enough to hurt. In the rearview mirror, the road behind me was gone. Just darkness, the same impenetrable black that blocked the way forward. I was suspended in a bubble of failing light, surrounded by nothing, going nowhere. Then the figures started walking toward the truck. From the trees, from the darkness, slow and deliberate, converging on my position from every direction. I could hear their footsteps now, crunching on gravel that should not exist, moving with a coordination that spoke of intelligence and purpose. I threw the transmission into reverse. The truck lurched backward. The headlights swung across the approaching figures and I saw them clearly for the first time. Faces that were almost human but stretched, distorted, like reflections in a funhouse mirror. Mouths that opened too wide. Hands with too many fingers reaching. The engine died. The headlights went out. Total darkness. Total silence except for the footsteps getting closer and my own breathing, fast and shallow and terrified. I fumbled for the flashlight. My hands found it. I pressed the button. Nothing happened. I pressed it again and again, panic rising like vomit in my throat. Dead battery. Impossible. I had replaced the batteries 2 days ago. But nothing was possible or impossible anymore. Those rules had stopped mattering somewhere back around mile marker 227. The footsteps stopped. In the darkness, I heard that breathing again. All around the truck now. Dozens of sources, all breathing in unison. In and out, slow and steady, patient. Then something touched the driver, the side window. A hand. Fingers. Too many of them, pressing against the glass. I could not see it, but I could hear it. The squeak of skin on glass. The sound of something testing the barrier between inside and outside. More hands touched the truck. The passenger window. The back window. The hood. The roof. All over, surrounding me, a chorus of touches that made the metal creak and groan. The truck rocked slightly, like they were testing its weight. Testing if they could tip it over. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, one hand still gripping the useless flashlight, the other clutching the wheel like it could save me. My mind was white noise and terror. No thoughts, no plans, just the animal knowledge that I was being hunted and had nowhere to run. Then as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The touching ceased. The breathing faded. Silence returned, deeper than before. I waited, every muscle locked, barely breathing myself, listening for any sound that would tell me what came next. The headlights came back on, bright and steady, illuminating the road ahead. A normal road, gravel and trees and darkness at the edges, but normal. Familiar. The GPS screen flickered to life, showing me at mile marker 251. The engine turned over without me touching the key, settling into its usual rough idle. In the rearview mirror, the road behind me was there again. Empty. No figures, no watchers, just the lonely stretch of the Dalton Highway running south toward civilization and sanity. I did not question it. I put the truck in drive and accelerated, watching the mile markers tick past. 252, 253, 254, each one in its proper place, the distance feeling right again, the world obeying its own rules once more. But I knew the truth. I had been somewhere else. Somewhere between the mile markers where distance becomes meaningless and things that should not exist wait patiently for travelers who stray into their territory. A place that overlaps with our roads but does not share our physics or our reality. I reached Dead Horse at dawn, delivered my cargo, turned around, and drove back. Different route, the long way. I will never drive that section of the Dalton Highway again. But sometimes late at night when I am hauling freight through the darkness, I check my GPS obsessively. I watch the mile markers flash past in my headlights. I count them, making sure each number follows the one before. Making sure the distance feels right. Because I know now that the roads we drive are thinner than we think. That there are spaces between the mile markers where the rules change and something watches from the trees, waiting for the next driver to see the same number twice and realize too late that they've left the world behind. And I wonder how many drivers never came back. How many times has mile marker 227 appeared where it should not be, trapping someone in that loop of impossible distance? How many trucks sit abandoned in that place between places, their drivers taken or transformed or simply erased? I will never know, but I will never stop checking the mile markers. Never stop counting. Never stop making sure that the distance feels right. Because out there in the darkness, the road still repeats. And it is always hungry. Story 7. Car began to slow on its own. What if the thing driving your car was not you anymore? That question haunted me as I felt the steering wheel turn beneath my hands without my permission. The car began to slow on its own on an empty Alaskan road after midnight, and I understood in that moment that I was no longer in control of anything that was happening to me. The speedometer dropped from 65 to 55 without me touching the brake pedal. My foot was still pressed on the gas. I could feel the engine resisting, the transmission fighting against my acceleration. But the car was slowing anyway, deliberately, methodically, like something invisible was squeezing the life out of the engine, forcing it into submission. In Alaska, mechanical issues are common. The cold does terrible things to vehicles. Engines freeze, fuel lines crack, batteries die in the darkness. But this felt different. This felt timed. This felt intentional. A car does not slowly decelerate on a straight stretch of empty highway in the middle of the night unless something is actively stopping it. Something that understands how cars work. Something that knows exactly how much pressure to apply to slow a vehicle down without causing it to stall. The road ahead was completely empty. There were no other cars. There were no lights from houses or towns. The only thing ahead was the terrifying black void of an Alaskan night. And the only thing behind me was exactly the same. I was alone on a highway that stretched for hundreds of miles in both directions, and whatever was controlling my car knew this. It was confident, unhurried, almost casual in the way it was taking control of my vehicle. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel harder, trying to force the car to maintain its speed. The muscles in my arms burned from the effort, but my attempt to regain control was useless. The car continued to slow. 50 miles per hour, 45, 40. The scary realization crept over me that stopping did not feel safer than continuing. In fact, the thought of coming to a complete halt on this empty road filled me with a terror so intense that it made my vision blur at the edges. I was driving a rental Jeep with almost a full tank of gas. I had picked it up in Fairbanks earlier that evening before heading south toward the interior, hoping to make it to the next town before dark. That plan had failed. The highway was longer than I remembered from the map. The distances in Alaska are deceptive. Towns that appear close together on paper are actually separated by hundreds of miles of nothing. By the time I realized I would not make it to civilization before nightfall, it was already too late to turn back. The speedometer read 30 miles per hour. The car was now moving at a crawl. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the wheel. I kept my foot pressed firmly on the gas pedal, trying to fight whatever force was slowing me down. But it was like pushing against a wall. The harder I pressed, the more resistance I felt. The car continued its steady deceleration. I wanted to scream. I wanted to pull over and stop the vehicle and get out and run away from this nightmare. But that instinct was overridden by something stronger. A bone-deep certainty that leaving the car would be the worst possible decision I could make. As long as I was inside the vehicle, With the doors locked and the engine running, I had some small measure of protection. But stepping outside, out into that absolute darkness, into that cold and emptiness, felt like stepping into the jaws of something hungry. 20 miles per hour. The car was barely crawling now. My headlights cut through the darkness in a tunnel of pale illumination, revealing only the asphalt directly in front of me and the edge of the road where it dissolved into the black forest beyond. The trees on either side of the highway were ancient spruce, their branches heavy with snow and ice. They seemed to lean toward the road, as if watching the car, its progress with interest. That was when I saw it, a figure standing on the shoulder of the road, silhouetted against my headlights. It was completely motionless, utterly still in a way that living things are not supposed to be. A person, standing in the freezing cold at 2 a.m, wearing what looked like a hospital gown. Even in the poor light, I could see that the figure was barefoot. The feet were dark, stained, or perhaps just blue from the cold. The car slowed to 15 miles per hour. The figure did not move or look at me. It simply stood there, staring in a direction that was not toward the road, looking at something in the forest, something that my eyes could not see. The chilling atmosphere became so thick and suffocating that I could barely breathe. Every instinct in my body screamed that this was wrong, that this was not natural, that this was something from a nightmare or a horror story, not something that could possibly exist in the real world. I tried to accelerate again. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, my body tensed, waiting for the engine to roar and the car to lurch forward. Instead, the car slowed even more, 10 miles per hour now, almost a walking pace. We were drawing closer to the figure with each passing second. The figure was definitely human. I could see the shape of a head, the outline of a body, the thin strips of cloth that made up the hospital gown fluttering in the frozen wind. But something about it was not right. The proportions were slightly off. The way it stood was too rigid, too perfect, like a doll or a mannequin that someone had positioned carefully on the side of the road. And then it turned its head. The movement was jerky and unnatural, like someone who had forgotten how joints worked. The head rotated toward the car, and I could see the face. What I saw in that moment will stay with me until the day I die. The face was wrong, completely and absolutely wrong. The eyes were too far apart. The mouth was too wide. The skin had a grayish tint that could never occur in a living human being. But the worst part was the expression. The thing that had once been a face was wearing a smile. A horrible, knowing smile that suggested it had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for my car to come down this road on this night. Waiting for me specifically. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the left, trying to swerve away from the figure. The car did not respond. The wheel felt frozen in my hands. I could move it slightly, enough to feel the mechanism, but not enough to actually change the direction of the vehicle. The car continued forward in a perfectly straight line, moving at a crawl directly toward the thing on the side of the road. 5 miles per hour. The terrifying silence inside the car was broken only by the sound of my breathing and the soft rumble of the engine. The figure grew larger in my headlights. I could see details now that I did not want to see. The exposed skin had a texture like spoiled meat. There were dark marks around the wrists and neck, like bruising or residue from restraints. The feet were definitely dark, but not from cold. From something else, from something that had been rubbed or burned into the skin. The car came to a complete stop directly in front of the figure. For a moment that stretched into eternity, nothing happened. The engine idled. My headlights illuminated the impossible thing that stood just a few feet in front of my hood. And the thing stared back at me with those wrong eyes and that horrible smile. I could see its chest rising and falling, moving in time with my own breathing. We were breathing together. This terrifying creature and I were synchronized in a way that made my skin crawl. Then the figure moved. It stepped forward, moving in that same jerky, mechanical way, and placed its hands on the hood of my Jeep. The moment its palms made contact with the metal, I felt something change in the car. The temperature dropped instantly. My breath became visible as a white mist in front of my face. Ice began forming on the inside of the windows. The nightmare was accelerating. This was getting worse, not better. The creature bent down and placed its face directly in front of my windshield. I could see every detail now. The eyes were not actually eyes at all. They were dark sockets filled with something that looked like moving liquid. The mouth opened impossibly wide, wider than any human mouth could open. And I could see that there was nothing inside. Just blackness. Just an endless void where there should have been teeth or a throat or anything resembling the interior of a living being. I screamed. I could not help it. The sound that came out of my mouth was raw and primal and filled with a level of terror that I had never experienced before. I was not screaming words. I was not screaming for help. I was just screaming because the thing in front of me was so wrong, so fundamentally opposed to everything that made sense in the universe, that my mind could not process it in any other way. The creature's mouth widened even further. That horrible smile grew bigger. And then it did something that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. It spoke, not with words, not with anything resembling human speech, but with a sound that came from the void in its mouth. A sound that was less like a voice and more like the screams of countless people layered on top of each other. A harmony of terror and pain and suffering that went on, building in intensity, filling the car completely. The engine died. The lights went out. The heat shut off. Suddenly I was sitting in absolute darkness, and the only thing I could hear was that horrifying chorus of screams still emanating from the thing that was pressed against my windshield. I could not see it, but I could feel it. The car was rocking slightly, as if the creature was pushing against it with increasing force. My hands fumbled for the ignition. I turned the key. The engine would not start. I tried again, and again. The starter motor would not even engage. It was like the entire car had died, not just the electrical systems but something deeper, something fundamental. The vehicle that had been protecting me was no longer functioning. It was no longer a refuge. It was a tomb, a metal box that was trapping me with something that wanted to hurt me. I grabbed the door handle and pulled. The door would not open. I tried the other doors. All locked, all immovable. I threw my body against the driver's side window, hoping to break the glass. The window did not crack. The impact just sent waves of pain through my shoulder and a terrible realization through my mind that I was trapped. Completely and absolutely trapped in this car with whatever was outside. The creatures, screaming, intensified. The car began to shake more violently. The windshield started to frost over, thick layers of ice coating the glass from the inside. My breath was coming in ragged gasps. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst. The eerie terror of my situation was beyond anything I could have imagined. This was not fear. This was the complete and total dissolution of everything I believed about the world and my place in it. And then I heard the sound of scratching. Long, slow scrapes against the metal of the car. The creature was raking its fingers along the hood, along the doors, around the windows, slowly, deliberately, as if it was carving something into the vehicle, as if it was marking me as its own. The scratching continued for what felt like hours but could only have been minutes. And with each scratch, the car seemed to become colder, more hostile, more raw. I understood then that the vehicle I was sitting in was no longer just a machine. It was becoming something else. It was being transformed by proximity to this thing. It was being corrupted, made into something that was no longer entirely of this world. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise had been. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I could hear the blood rushing through my veins. I could hear myself breathing. But I could not hear the creature. It was gone, or hiding, or waiting. I waited in that darkness for a long time. Long enough for my panic to fade and be replaced by a hollow sense of despair. Long enough for me to accept that whatever was happening to me, it was not going to end well. Long enough for me to understand that I was never going to leave this road. That I was going to remain in this car, in this spot, for the rest of my life. The engine suddenly roared to life. The lights blazed on, so bright they hurt my eyes. The car was warm again. Everything appeared normal. The windshield was clear. The doors were unlocked. The creature was gone. Everything was exactly as it had been before, except for one thing. The car began to accelerate on its own. I was not pressing the gas pedal. My foot was nowhere near it. But the engine was roaring and the car was moving faster and faster down the empty highway. 60 miles per hour, 70, 80. The trees on both sides of the road became a blur of darkness. The fear that gripped me was different now. It was not the fear of something external. It was the terrifying knowledge that the car was driving itself toward something. Toward some destination that it knew, and I did not. The speedometer climbed higher, 90 miles per hour. The road was still completely empty. There were no other vehicles. No lights, no signs of civilization. Just mile after mile of Alaskan highway disappearing into the darkness ahead. And then I saw it. In the distance, a light, a single yellow light glowing in the darkness. As I got closer, I could see that it was the light from a building. A house, a small cabin made of dark wood, set back from the highway by maybe 50 feet. The car was slowing down now, gradually, deliberately, just as it had slowed before, and I knew with absolute certainty that this was where the car was taking me. This was where the creature wanted me to go. The car pulled into the driveway of the cabin. The engine shut off, the lights extinguished, and in the silence that followed, I could see the cabin more clearly. The windows were dark, the door was closed, but there was something on the porch. Several somethings, shapes, figures, standing motionless in the darkness, arranged in a perfect line, all facing toward my car. I could not count how many there were. 10, maybe 20, more, all wearing the same hospital gown. All barefoot, all standing with that same rigid, unnatural posture. And all of them turned their heads toward my car at exactly the same moment. All of them smiled that horrible, knowing smile. My hands reached for the door handle without my permission. My body was moving, but it was not moving because I wanted it to move. It was moving because something was making it move. The door opened. The cold Alaskan air flooded into the car, carrying with it a smell like rotting meat and antiseptic. A hospital smell, a death smell. I stood up, and my legs carried me toward the cabin. Toward the figures, toward whatever unsettling nightmare was waiting for me there. I tried to resist, I tried to stop, but my body was no longer my own. It had been taken over, possessed, controlled by forces that I did not understand and could not fight. The figures parted as I approached, creating a path toward the cabin door. The door swung open on silent hinges, and I could see inside. A hallway, lights along the walls, hospital lights, and beds, dozens of beds, hundreds of beds, stretching back into a space that could not possibly fit inside a cabin. A hallway that went on forever, filled with people, all lying still, all hooked up to tubes and machines that beeped and whirred in the darkness. I took a step toward that door, and then another, and I understood, finally, what was happening. I was not being dragged into some supernatural nightmare. I was being taken home, to a place that I had been trying to escape from, a place that had been calling me back all along, a place that I had never actually left, because I was already lying in one of those beds. My body was there, right now, hooked up to machines and tubes. My consciousness was elsewhere, trapped in a car driving down an Alaskan highway, experiencing a terrifying nightmare that felt completely real. And whatever force controlled this place was showing me that escape was impossible. That consciousness or not, real or not, awake or not, I belonged here. The cabin door closed behind me, and I was finally home. Story 8, gas station that was still lit. I should have kept driving. That is the thought that wakes me up every night now, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs like something trying to escape. I should have trusted that creeping sense of dread that wrapped around my chest the moment I saw those fluorescent lights cutting through the Alaskan darkness like a knife through black water. But I was tired, so tired, and the fuel gauge had been flashing red for the last 20 miles of empty highway. Each blink a countdown to being stranded in the kind of wilderness that swallows people whole. Late at night in Alaska, a lit gas station usually means relief. It means warmth, coffee, maybe a bathroom that does not smell like death itself. It means you are not alone in the vast, crushing emptiness that stretches for hundreds of miles in every direction. But driving through Alaska after midnight, pulling into that parking lot, I felt none of that relief. The lot was empty and silent in a way that felt wrong. Not peaceful, not quiet, wrong, like the silence after a scream, like the pause between lightning and thunder, when you know something terrible is coming but you cannot run. Pulling in felt like crossing a line, an invisible boundary between the world I knew and something else, something darker. The station was one of those old places you see scattered across forgotten highways. Peeling paint, flickering sign that probably had not been updated since the 80s. 2 ancient pumps standing like sentinels under a metal canopy that groaned in the wind. But every single light was on. The fluorescent tubes inside buzzed with that distinctive hum that gets under your skin, that makes your teeth ache. Through the smudged windows, I could see rows of chips and candy bars, a coffee machine in the corner, a register near the back. Everything looked normal. Everything looked exactly as it should, except there was nobody there. I sat in my truck for a full minute, engine idling, windshield wipers pushing away the light mist that had started to fall. The radio had gone to static about 40 miles back, nothing but white noise and the occasional burst of what might have been voices speaking in a language I did not recognize. I had turned it off. Now the only sound was my breathing and the tick of the cooling engine and that wind rattling the canopy overhead. The smart thing would have been to leave, to drive on fumes until I found another station or ran out completely and dealt with the consequences in daylight. But fear does strange things to logic. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that whoever worked here had probably just stepped out back for a smoke or was in the bathroom. I told myself that empty gas stations in the middle of nowhere were not inherently sinister, just sad and lonely. I told myself a lot of things that night. None of them were true. The cold hit me the moment I stepped out. Not the normal Alaskan cold that bites and stings. This was different. Heavier, like stepping into a walk-in freezer where something had died and been left to rot. The smell came with it, faint but unmistakable beneath the odor of gasoline and pine trees. Something organic, something decaying. I pulled my jacket tighter and headed for the pump, keys jangling too loud in the oppressive quiet. The pump clicked on when I lifted the handle. Numbers rolling on that old mechanical display, the kind that spins instead of digital. I started filling up, watching those numbers climb, watching the mist swirl under the lights in patterns that almost looked deliberate. Almost looked like figures moving just beyond the edge of vision. That is when I noticed the handprint on the window. Small, child-sized, pressed against the glass from the inside, fingers splayed wide. But wrong. The proportions were off. The fingers too long, too thin, and it was not made from the oil and dirt of a normal hand. This print was dark, almost black, and it glistened wet under the fluorescent lights like it had just been made. My hand froze on the pump handle. The numbers kept climbing. $30, $40. I could not look away from that handprint. Could not shake the feeling that if I stared long enough, I would see it move. See those two long fingers curl inward or slide down the glass, leaving dark streaks in their wake. The pump clicked off. Tank full. The sound jolted me back to reality. Or what passed for it in that moment. I needed to pay. I needed to get back in my truck and drive as far and as fast as this tank of gas would take me. But the register was inside. Inside with the lights and the handprint and the absence of any living thing. The door chimed when I pushed it open. A cheerful electronic melody that belonged in a different world. A safer world. The warmth inside was worse than the cold outside. Stifling. Thick. Like the air itself had weight and texture. That smell was stronger here. Rotting meat wrapped in chemicals. Formaldehyde and decay. Nobody at the register. Nobody in the aisles. The coffee machine burbled to itself in the corner. Half a pot of black sludge that looked like it had been there for days. Weeks. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Some of them flickering in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. I walked to the counter. Footsteps echoing on the cracked linoleum. And that is when I saw the logbook. It was old, leather-bound, lying open next to the register like someone had been writing in it moments before. The pages were yellowed and brittle, covered in handwriting that varied wildly from entry to entry. Different people, different pens, all of them writing the same thing. I stopped here. I should not have stopped here. Over and over, page after page. Some entries were dated. Most were not. The oldest I could find was from 1987. The newest was from 2 days ago. My hands shook as I turned the pages, reading fragments that made my blood run cold. The attendant smiled, but his eyes were empty. I heard my daughter calling from the back room, but my daughter died 3 years ago. Do not go to the bathroom. Whatever you do not go to the bathroom. They are in the walls. I can hear them breathing. I slammed the book shut. The sound echoed through the empty station like a gunshot. Silence rushed back in to fill the space, heavier than before. Oppressive. Watching. That is when I heard the knocking. Slow, deliberate. 3 measured taps coming from somewhere in the back of the station. Past the aisles of junk food and motor oil. Past the door marked, employees only, that hung slightly ajar. Darkness yawning beyond it like an open mouth. Knock, knock, knock. I should have run. Every instinct screaming at me to turn around and sprint for my truck and never look back. But something held me frozen. Some terrible curiosity. Some need to know what was making that sound in the dark. The knocking came again. Same rhythm, same spacing, and then I heard something else beneath it. Breathing, wet and labored. The sound of lungs that were not working quite right. Lungs that were damaged or diseased, or maybe not lungs at all, but something else wearing the shape of human respiration. I backed toward the door, slowly, keeping my eyes on that darkened doorway in the back. The breathing got louder, closer, and then I saw movement in the shadows. Something pale shifting in the darkness. Something that might have been an arm or a leg or something else entirely. Something with too many joints. My hand found the exit door. I pushed through. The chime sounded cheerful and obscene. I ran for my truck, keys slipping in my shaking fingers, the mist now thick enough that the gas pumps looked like ghosts in the distance. The breathing followed me. I could hear it even over the sound of my own panicked gasps. Even over the crunch of gravel under my boots. I got the door open, threw myself inside, slammed it shut and locked it and jammed the key into the ignition, all in one fluid motion born of pure terror. The engine turned over. Once. Twice, the battery whined. Come on, come on. Something hit my window. That same small handprint, pressed against the glass from outside now. Those two long fingers spreading wide. I could see the texture of the skin. Pale, waterlogged, like something that had been submerged for a very long time. And behind it, in the mist, a face. If you could call it that. Features that were almost human but stretched and wrong. Eyes too far apart. Mouth too wide. Teeth too numerous and sharp. The engine caught. I threw it in reverse and punched the gas. The tires spun on the wet gravel, caught, and I rocketed backward out of that parking lot. The thing at my window fell away. I cranked the wheel, shifted into drive, and floored it. In my rearview mirror, the gas station lights flickered once, twice, and then every single one went dark at the same moment. The darkness that rushed in was absolute, total, like the building had never been there at all. I drove for 6 hours straight, did not stop until I hit Fairbanks and there were people and noise and daylight breaking over the mountains. I filled up at a busy truck stop, hands still shaking so bad I could barely work the pump. The attendant was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a kind smile. Normal, human, real. I asked her about the station, described the location as best I could. She looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. There has not been a gas station on that stretch of road for 15 years, she said quietly. Place burned down in 2009. Whole family died, owner and his 2 kids. They never found the bodies. I checked my receipt, the one I grabbed from the counter in my panic. The paper was old, faded. The date printed at the top was November 3rd, 1987. The same year as the first entry in that logbook. I still have that receipt. I keep it in my wallet as a reminder. A warning. Late at night in Alaska, a lit gas station usually means relief. But sometimes, it means something else. Something that exists in the spaces between what is and what was. Something that waits in the fluorescent buzz and the chemical smell and the empty parking lots for people like me. People too tired or too desperate to trust their instincts. I still drive that highway sometimes. I have to for work. But now, when I see lights cutting through the darkness in the distance, I keep driving. I do not care if the tank is empty. I do not care if I have to walk 20 miles in the freezing cold. Because I know what is waiting in places like that. I know what watches from the shadows with its 2 long fingers and its wet, labored breathing. And I know that some doors, once you cross through them, lead to places you can never truly leave. The gas station is still out there. Still lit. Still waiting. And someday, someone else will pull into that empty parking lot. They will tell themselves they are being paranoid. They will tell themselves it is just a gas station. They will tell themselves a lot of things. None of them will be true. Story 9. Drive that took longer than time allowed. I should have reached Fairbanks 3 hours ago, but according to my dashboard clock, I had been driving for 7 hours straight, and the mile markers told me I had only covered 83 miles. Let me be clear about something disturbing right from the start. I am not the kind of person who believes in scary stories or haunted highways. I work in logistics. I understand routes, distances, fuel consumption. Numbers do not lie. But that night in Alaska, somewhere between Talk and Fairbanks on the lonely stretch of Highway 2, every single number stopped making sense, and the creepy reality of what was happening made my hands shake on the wheel. The darkness in Alaska during winter is not like darkness anywhere else in America. It swallows everything. No moon, no stars through the thick clouds, just my headlights cutting through an endless black void and the occasional reflective sign floating past like a ghost. The radio had gone to static hours before, leaving only the hum of my tires on frozen asphalt and the horrifying silence of absolute isolation. I kept checking the clock. This became an obsession, a terrifying ritual. Every time I looked, the numbers seemed wrong. At 11:47 p.m., I passed mile marker 1,302. I drove for what felt like an hour, maintaining 65 miles per hour on the empty highway. When I checked again, the clock read 11:52 p.m. 5 minutes. Impossible. But there it was, and the next mile marker I passed read 1,308. 6 miles and 5 minutes at 65 miles per hour. The math was nightmare fuel. My gas gauge had not moved either. This detail seemed minor at first, almost a relief. But as the hours stretched and twisted, it became another chilling piece of evidence that something deeply unsettling was wrong with this stretch of road. The forest pressed in on both sides, thick and impenetrable. Black spruce trees stood like dark sentinels, their branches heavy with snow that never seemed to fall. The temperature outside registered at -18 degrees. Inside my truck, The heater blasted warm air that smelled faintly of rust and fear. I am a professional driver. I haul equipment across Alaska for mining operations, oil fields, remote construction sites. I have driven this highway dozens of times. I know every truck stop, every dangerous curve, every place where ice forms treacherous patches. But that night, nothing looked familiar. The road itself seemed wrong, like a copy of the real highway, close enough to recognize but wrong in ways I could not quite identify. The disturbing feeling started around mile marker 1,295. I had just refueled at a small station outside Talk, grabbed coffee, checked my route. Everything normal. The attendant, an older native Alaskan man, had looked at me strangely when I mentioned driving through the night to Fairbanks. "Storm coming," he had said, his voice carrying an eerie warning tone. "Maybe wait until morning." I had smiled, thanked him, driven off into the darkness. Now I wished I had listened. Now I understood that the fear in his eyes had been real. At what my clock insisted was 12:14 a.m., though it should have been well past 2 a.m. by my calculations, I saw the first horrifying sign that I was not alone on this highway. Tire tracks in the fresh snow on the shoulder. They ran parallel to my route for maybe a quarter mile, then veered sharply into the forest. No skid marks, no sign of an accident, just a clean turn into the trees, as if the driver had simply decided to drive into the wilderness at full speed. The tracks looked fresh. The scary part was that I had not seen another vehicle for hours. I slowed down, peering into the forest where the tracks disappeared. My headlights caught something between the trees. A reflection. Eyes, maybe, or ice, or something else. Whatever it was, it moved when I looked at it, retreating deeper into the darkness. I accelerated. The engine roared. The speedometer climbed to 70, then 75. The mile markers continued their slow, impossible progression. 1,310, 1,311, 1,313. But when I checked the clock, only minutes had passed. The night refused to advance. Time had become elastic, stretching in disturbing ways that violated every law of physics I understood. The coffee from the gas station sat in my cup holder, still hot. It should have gone cold hours ago, but steam still rose from the surface, curling in the dashboard lights like something alive. My phone had no signal. This was normal for rural Alaska. What was not normal was the way the screen glitched when I tried to check the time. The numbers flickered, showing impossible dates: February 31st, October 45th, times like 25 to 73 p.m. Then it would reset to something seemingly normal, but always wrong, always slightly off from what the dashboard clock showed. The terrifying isolation pressed in. No other cars, no houses, no lights except my own. Just the highway unreeling endlessly through the frozen darkness, leading nowhere, taking forever, defying time itself. At mile marker 1,320, I saw the second vehicle. A semi-truck, parked on the shoulder, lights off, no driver visible. Snow had accumulated on the hood, but not much. Maybe an hour's worth. I slowed as I passed, looking for signs of distress, a reason the truck had stopped. Nothing, just an abandoned rig sitting silent in the horrifying emptiness. Then I saw my reflection in its dark windows as I passed. Except the reflection showed my truck driving in the opposite direction, heading back toward Talk. I watched this impossible image for 3 full seconds before it faded into darkness. The fear became physical then. My chest tightened. Breathing felt difficult. The warm air from the heater suddenly seemed too hot, suffocating. I cracked the window. The frigid air that rushed in carried a smell I could not identify. Not pine, not snow, something organic and raw, like decay in cold storage. I had been driving for what felt like 10 hours. The clock showed 12:47 a.m. I had covered maybe 40 miles since leaving the gas station. At this rate, I would reach Fairbanks sometime next week, or never. The disturbing mathematics of the situation kept spiraling in my head, creating nightmares of logic that refused to resolve. The highway began to curve more than I remembered. Long, sweeping turns that seemed to lead back on themselves. I would drive for miles, then see the same distinctive tree formation I had passed what felt like an hour before. The same lightning-struck spruce, split down the middle and dead white against the living forest. I saw it 3 times, each time at a different mile marker, each time from a slightly different angle that made no geographic sense. Something was keeping me on this highway. Something was stretching the distance, bending time, creating a loop or a trap or something my mind could not fully comprehend. The scary realization settled into my bones with the cold, I was not going to reach Fairbanks. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. At mile marker 1,328, I found the source of the tire tracks. A pickup truck, older model, had indeed driven straight into the forest. I could see it now, maybe 30 yards off the road, wrapped around a massive spruce tree. The collision should have been devastating, but the truck sat there almost gently, as if it had been placed rather than crashed. No shattered glass, no deployed airbags visible, no blood. The driver, his door hung open. I should have kept driving. Every horror movie, every creepy story, every terrifying urban legend warns against investigating. But the isolation and fear had been building for hours, and seeing another human being, even a dead one, seemed preferable to the chilling loneliness of that endless highway. I pulled over, put the truck in park. The engine continued its steady rumble. I left it running. No way was I risking being stranded in this nightmare with a dead battery. The cold hit me like a physical force when I stepped out. -18 degrees, but it felt colder. The kind of cold that burns exposed skin in minutes. That makes breathing painful. That kills with patient efficiency. I pulled my hood up, wrapped my scarf tighter, and walked toward the wrecked truck. The snow crunched under my boots with a sound that seemed too loud in the horrifying silence. No wind, no animal sounds, just that oppressive quiet that Alaska does better than anywhere else, magnified by whatever supernatural wrongness had infected this stretch of highway. As I got closer, I saw details that made the fear worse. The truck's windows were frosted over from the inside, suggesting it had been abandoned with the heat running. But the engine was cold, long dead. The door hung open at an angle that suggested violence, like someone had kicked it open in a desperate hurry. Inside, I found a thermos of coffee. Still warm, impossible, but true. Steam rose from the open top. Next to it sat a road atlas, open to a page showing the Highway 2 route. Someone had drawn a circle in red ink around mile marker 1,302, the exact marker where my disturbing night had begun. Written in the margin, in cramped, terrified handwriting, were 4 words: "The drive takes forever." Below that, in larger letters, increasingly desperate, "Cannot reach Fairbanks. Time wrong, highway wrong, something watching. Do not stop, do not leave truck, it wants you outside." The last line was underlined 3 times, the pen tearing through the paper. I ran back to my truck, sprinted through snow that grabbed at my boots like hands. The darkness between the trees seemed to pulse, alive with unseen movement. Shadows within shadows, the scary certainty that I was being observed pressed down like physical weight. I made it back to my truck, slammed the door, locked it. My breath came in ragged gasps that fogged the windows. On the dashboard, the clock read 12:51 a.m. Only 4 minutes had passed. I had been outside for at least 15. I put the truck in drive and accelerated hard. The tires spun for a heart-stopping second before finding traction. In my rearview mirror, I watched the abandoned truck recede into darkness. Just before it disappeared, I saw a figure standing beside it. Tall, impossibly thin, not moving, just standing there in the -18-degree cold, watching me drive away. The mile markers continued their slow procession. 1,329, 1,331, 1,334, each one taking what felt like miles of driving but only minutes of time. The horrifying disconnect between distance and duration had become my new reality. At 1:03 a.m., by the lying clock on my dashboard, I saw headlights behind me. Finally, another vehicle, another human being. Relief flooded through me so intensely I almost cried. The lights grew closer, a semi-truck, moving fast. Too fast for the conditions. I pulled slightly right, giving it room to pass. But it did not pass. It settled in behind me, matching my speed exactly, maintaining the same unsettling distance. I accelerated, 70 miles per hour, 75, 80. The semi kept pace. I could see the driver now in my mirrors. Or rather, I could see the cab was dark. No driver visible, just headlights pursuing me through the nightmare darkness. Then I recognized the truck, the same semi I had seen parked on the shoulder hours before. Abandoned. But now it was behind me, driving itself, keeping perfect pace through curves I took at dangerous speeds. The terror became pure, primal. I was being hunted by something that wore the shape of familiar things. Something that twisted reality, that bent time, that turned an ordinary highway into a trap from which there was no escape. I pushed my truck to its limits. 90 miles per hour on ice-slicked asphalt. Madness. But the alternative was letting that driverless semi catch me, and every instinct screamed that I could not let that happen. The highway straightened, a long, empty stretch where I could see for miles. Except I could not see miles. The road simply faded into black about a quarter mile ahead, as if the world ended there. But as I drove toward that dark boundary, it receded, always maintaining the same distance. Always just out of reach. The semi fell back, the headlights dimmed, then disappeared. I was alone again with the darkness and the slowly advancing mile markers and the clock that refused to move forward in any meaningful way. At marker 1350, I made a decision born of desperation and creeping insanity. I stopped the truck in the middle of the highway, turned off the engine, let the silence and cold and darkness surround me completely. If time was broken, if distance meant nothing, if I could never reach Fairbanks by driving, then maybe the answer was to stop trying. The temperature inside the cab began dropping immediately. My breath formed clouds. The windows frosted over, and in that chilling quiet, I heard something I had not heard before. A sound underneath everything. A low hum, almost subsonic, like massive machinery operating far below the earth. The highway was not a road. It was something else, something alive or conscious or wrong in ways that defied description. The scary truth settled into my understanding like ice forming on water. This stretch of Highway 2 existed outside normal space and time. It was a pocket, a trap, a feeding ground for something that sustained itself on isolation and fear. I restarted the truck. The engine caught on the third try. On the dashboard, the clock read 1:15 a.m. I had been stopped for what felt like 20 minutes. And then I saw the lights ahead. Not headlights, something else. A soft glow through the trees on both sides of the highway. Orange and warm, like campfires or lanterns. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, stretching into the forest as far as I could see. As I drove closer, the lights resolved into windows. Hundreds of vehicles parked among the trees. Cars, trucks, semis, RVs, all abandoned, all with their interior lights still on, glowing like horrifying jack-o'-lanterns in the frozen wilderness. Every single one of them had been trying to reach Fairbanks. Every driver had thought they were on a normal highway, making a normal drive. And every one of them had been caught by whatever haunted this impossible stretch of road. The disturbing realization hit me then. I was not going to escape. The drive would continue forever, eating hours while giving back only minutes, consuming distance while covering almost none. Eventually, my fuel would run out, despite the gauge that refused to move. Eventually, I would have to stop. And when I did, I would join those other vehicles in the forest, my truck, its lights adding one more glow to the terrifying collection. Unless I could find the edge, the place where the normal highway resumed, where time moved correctly again and distance meant what it should mean and Fairbanks actually existed as a destination rather than an impossible dream. I drove faster. The mile markers accelerated their pace. 1,360, 1,375, 1,390. The clock barely moved. 1:17 a.m., 1:19 a.m., still deep in the night that refused to end. And then, at mile marker 1,402, everything changed. The darkness ahead suddenly had depth again. Stars became visible through a break in the clouds. The radio crackled to life with classic rock and weather reports. The clock jumped forward to 3:47 a.m., and my fuel gauge dropped to a quarter tank. I crossed some invisible boundary, and reality snapped back into place like a rubber band released. The horror ended not with a climax, but with a simple transition. 1 second I was in the nightmare. The next I was on a normal highway, approaching the lights of Fairbanks like they had been there all along. I pulled into the first gas station I found, filled the tank with shaking hands. Inside, the attendant looked at me with concern that felt real and human and anchored in normal reality. "You okay?" she asked. I wanted to tell her about the highway, the stretch time, the abandoned vehicles glowing in the forest, the thing that hunted on that road. But what would I say? That I had driven for what felt like 10 hours, but the clock said only 4? That distance had become meaningless and time had stretched like taffy. "Long drive," I managed. She nodded, rang up my coffee and fuel. "Be careful out there," she said. "That stretch between here and Talk can be weird at night." I drove back to my company depot in Fairbanks. Logged my hours, 4 hours of drive time for a trip that should have taken 3. Close enough that nobody questioned it. But I remembered every minute of those 10 nightmare hours. The fear does not fade. And sometimes, late at night, I check the map and calculate the distance I actually covered. 83 miles in 7 hours. The math still does not work. The scary truth is that for a while, I was somewhere else. Somewhere that wore the shape of Highway 2 but was not really a highway at all. A place where the drive took longer than time allowed. I do not haul loads through that section anymore. I take longer routes. I tell dispatch I have mechanical concerns with steep grades. They believe me because I have never lied before. But the real reason is simple and terrifying. I am afraid that if I drive that highway again at night, I might not find the edge. I might join those other vehicles in the forest, my headlights adding to the disturbing glow, waiting forever in the darkness between mile markers that mean nothing. The drive took longer than time allowed. And somewhere in Alaska, on a stretch of highway that looks normal on every map, it still does. Story 10. Daylight did not bring relief. I thought the nightmare would end when the sun came out. That was the thing that would haunt me most in the weeks after I survived that Alaskan road. Not what happened in the darkness, but the false hope that daylight promised and then betrayed. When morning came during that terrible drive through the interior of Alaska, the road finally looked normal. The asphalt was dry, the sky was bright, the trees were just trees. But in Alaska, nights leave impressions that daylight does not erase. And as I drove through that cruel morning, I understood that some kinds of terror do not respect the boundaries between darkness and light. I had started that drive the previous afternoon in Fairbanks, a simple trip down the park's highway toward Denali. A drive that should have taken 5 hours. A drive that thousands of people make every single year without incident. The weather was clear when I left. The road conditions were good. My rental car was mechanically sound. Everything that could have been right was right. But somewhere along that stretch of highway, somewhere between the mountains and the forests, I had crossed into a place where the rules of normal reality no longer applied. The first sign of something being wrong came around 9 in the evening. My phone had no signal. That was not unusual for rural Alaska. Stretches of highway routinely went without cellular coverage. What was unusual was the complete and total absence of any other vehicles. I had been driving for nearly 3 hours and had not seen another car. Not one. On a major highway during the evening, there should have been traffic. There should have been 18-wheelers and trucks and other travelers. But the road was completely empty. Just me and the darkness pressing in from the sides of the highway. The fear that began to build in my chest was subtle at first. Just a slight tension in my shoulders. A feeling that something was not right. An unsettling sense that the world around me had changed in some way I could not quite articulate. I turned up the volume on the radio to push back against the creeping dread. Static filled the car. That was odd. The radio should have had at least a few stations. But as I scrolled through the frequencies, I found nothing but empty white noise. Nothing but that terrifying static that seemed to emphasize the isolation I was experiencing. I kept driving. What else could I do? Turning back would mean losing time, and staying in the car while parked on the side of a dark Alaskan highway seemed like the worst option. So I pressed forward, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, my eyes scanning the road ahead for any sign of another vehicle or a town or a gas station or anything that would break the eerie atmosphere that was settling over me. That was when I saw the figure on the road. It was standing in the center of the 2 lanes, motionless, waiting. My headlights illuminated a person wearing a dark winter coat. The figure did not move or wave or indicate in any way that it needed help. It just stood there, waiting. The nightmare had truly begun. Without thinking, I swerved to the left to avoid hitting the person. My tires crossed the center line. I expected to feel resistance from the asphalt, some kind of jolt to indicate I had hit something. But there was nothing. The figure simply vanished when my car passed through the space where it had been standing. I looked in my rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty. There was nothing there. No figure, no person, no indication that anything had ever been standing in the middle of the highway. My heart rate had elevated significantly. My palms were sweating despite the cold air blowing from the vents. I told myself it had been a trick of the light, a shadow, a deer that my mind had misidentified as human, a hallucination brought on by fatigue and stress. But I knew, with a certainty that I could not explain, that I had just seen something terrifying, something that did not belong to the normal world. I drove faster, 70 miles per hour, 80. The darkness seemed to press in harder the faster I went, as if my speed was making it angry. The highway curved through a dense forest of spruce trees that blocked out any light from the moon or stars. The road was a tunnel through absolute blackness, visible only in the narrow cone of illumination provided by my headlights. Every shadow could be hiding something. Every sound the car made seemed amplified in the silence. The eerie atmosphere had transformed into something more acute, more dangerous. And then I saw them. Multiple figures. all standing on the shoulders of the road. Some on the left, some on the right, all wearing the same dark winter clothing, all facing toward my car with their heads turned in the exact same direction, all watching me with an intensity that I could feel even from inside my locked vehicle. There were at least a dozen of them, maybe more, arranged along the highway like guides marking a path. My rational mind tried to find explanations. A group of hunters. People stranded after an accident. A strange celebration or gathering that I did not understand. But none of those explanations felt right. The way they stood was wrong. Too rigid. Too synchronized. When I looked at them, the terrifying realization crept over me that these were not living people. Not in any conventional sense. They were something else. Something wearing the shape of people but missing the essential quality that made humans real and present in the world. I did not slow down. I did not try to help them or ask what they needed. I just drove faster, pressing the accelerator to the floor, watching them blur past in my peripheral vision. My headlights flashed across their faces for just a moment, but that was long enough. Long enough to see that they had no eyes, just smooth expanses of skin where eyes should have been. Long enough to see that their mouths were open in expressions of joy or hunger or something between the two. The figures disappeared behind me as I drove, but the knowledge that they existed did not disappear. It settled into my mind like a stain that would never wash out. There were things on that road, things that looked human but were not human, things that wanted something from me. The horror of this realization was almost too much to process. My hands were shaking. My vision was starting to blur from the tears that were forming in my eyes. The highway began to climb. I was gaining elevation as the road took me deeper into the mountains. The forest became denser if that was possible. The darkness seemed to have weight and substance. It was not just the absence of light. It was an active, suffocating presence, a darkness that wanted to smother me. The creepy feeling that had started as a small discomfort had grown into a full-blown panic that was threatening to overwhelm my ability to think clearly. I was going to crash. I knew this with absolute certainty. I was too scared to drive safely. My reaction time was compromised. My ability to concentrate was gone. The highway in front of me kept blurring. The road would kill me in the darkness. It would take me off a cliff or into a tree or into a head-on collision with something moving in the opposite direction. This was how it was going to end. In a burning wreck on some forgotten stretch of Alaskan highway, miles from anyone who could help me. But I did not crash. The hours passed. The skies slowly began to lighten. Gray replaced black. The stars faded. The darkness that had seemed so absolute and permanent began to recede. And slowly, gradually, the sun started to rise. When daylight finally came, I nearly wept with relief. The morning light was golden and clear and completely normal. The road looked like any other highway. The trees were just trees. The sky was bright blue. Everything that had seemed so terrifying and wrong in the darkness suddenly appeared to be perfectly ordinary. The shadows were gone. The sense of wrongness had receded. The nightmare was over. Daylight did not bring relief. It brought something worse. It brought the terrible knowledge that what I had experienced was real. In the morning light, I could see the road clearly, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. The highway was wrong. Completely wrong. There were marks on the asphalt that looked like scratches or claw marks. Deep grooves carved into the road surface as if something massive and heavy had been clawing at the pavement. There were symbols painted on the guardrail, strange designs that looked almost like writing, but not quite. Not in any language I could recognize. There were places where the road had cracked and broken, and through the cracks I could see something beneath the asphalt. Something that looked like it might be moving. The feeling that my drive was finished was overwhelming. I needed to get off this road. I needed to reach a town. I needed to see other people and hear normal sounds and convince myself that I had not gone insane during the night. But the unsettling knowledge that the feeling did not go away even as I drove was the most terrifying realization of all. I understood that I could leave the road. I could reach safety. I could tell people what I had seen and they would not believe me. They would smile politely and suggest that I had experienced some kind of stress-induced hallucination. They would be wrong, because I was starting to understand the truth about that road and the things that inhabited it. It was not just a stretch of highway that went through a dangerous wilderness. It was a place that existed on the border between our world and somewhere else. A place where things that did not belong in daylight waited in the darkness. A place that called to certain people and drew them in. A place that left its mark on those who survived it. In the morning light, I could see other cars parked along the shoulder of the road. Vehicles that had been abandoned. A blue sedan from the 1970s. A red pickup truck with flat tires. A green minivan with the driver's side door hanging open. The cars were arranged at regular intervals, spaced evenly along the highway like monuments to those who had not survived their journey. My hands began to shake again as I realized the terrifying truth. These were the cars of people who had seen the figures in the darkness. People who had experienced the same horror that I had experienced. People who had not made it out. How many of them had there been? How many people had driven down this road and encountered the things that waited in the darkness? How many cars were scattered along this stretch of highway? Monuments to tragedy and terror. The horror of these thoughts was almost unbearable. I was driving past the last resting places of dead people. People whose bodies might still be in those vehicles. People who had made the same mistake that I had made. Getting on this road. Staying on this road. Not turning back when they had the chance. I tried to call for help on my phone. Still no signal. The mountains were too high. The wilderness was too vast. I was alone in that landscape with no way to communicate with the outside world. And as I drove through the clear morning light, I became aware of something that made the remaining hair on the back of my neck stand up. The figures were still there. In the daylight, they were harder to see. But they were there, standing in the forest, between the trees, in the shadows of the rocks, watching the road, watching my car pass, not moving, not threatening, just observing. The daylight had not made them go away. It had only made them more subtle, more patient. The eerie realization that they were waiting for something gave me chills that had nothing to do with the temperature. I saw the sign marking a town. Cantwell, a small settlement, civilization. I pressed harder on the accelerator. The car responded. The road ahead straightened out. I could see buildings in the distance, structures, people, normal human activity. I was going to make it. I was going to reach safety and leave this terrible road behind. The car began to slow down, without me touching the brake. Without any mechanical failure, the car simply began to decelerate on its own, just as it had the night before, just as if it was being pulled backward by an invisible force. My foot mashed against the gas pedal, but it made no difference. The car was slowing down. It did not want to leave this place. It wanted to stay on this road where it belonged, where the things in the darkness could touch it. The settlement ahead began to fade and blur. My vision was being obscured by something. A mist, fog rolling across the road. Fog that should not exist in the clear morning light. Fog that was swallowing the town and my hope of escape. The horrifying understanding came to me that I was not going to reach safety. That the road was not going to let me go. That I would be trapped here, on this stretch of highway, for the rest of my life. In the fog, I could see them. The figures, walking toward the road from the forest. Dozens of them, hundreds of them, all wearing their dark winter coats. All moving with that same jerky, unnatural gait. All making a sound like wind through a canyon. A sound like moaning. A sound like the earth itself was crying out in pain. The car came to a complete stop on the asphalt. I was immobilized, trapped, and as the figures surrounded my vehicle, their faces turned toward my windows with those terrible empty sockets where eyes should have been, I understood the final terrifying truth. The morning had not been a reprieve. It had been a preparation. A chance for me to see what was really happening. To understand that the nighttime horror was not something that could be left behind. To realize that some roads do not let their travelers escape. The fog consumed everything. The figures came closer, and the last thing I experienced before the darkness took me completely was the sound of hands pressing against the metal of the car. Hands that felt cold and wrong. Hands that wanted to drag me down into the depths of this cursed road. Hands that belonged to all the people who had driven here before me. The drive felt finished, but the feeling did not. The terrible, unsettling knowledge that I would never leave this place remained. It would stay with me forever, growing stronger, growing hungrier, waiting for the next person to drive down that road at night. Most people treat these stories as background noise. The ones who subscribe understand something else. Midnight Whispers Stories is a growing archive of real night experiences, roads, towns, motels, and moments people never forgot. Subscribe now, because the next story will feel even closer, and you'll want it waiting for you the next night.